If you go back just a few decades, this technology barely existed outside a handful of experimental test sites in the Caribbean. But today, if you dive along the coastlines of Indonesia, the Maldives, or the Bahamas, you can find entire underwater structures where dead coral rubble has transformed into thriving reef in a fraction of the time nature usually takes. They're called Biorock reefs, and they have been documented by marine researchers to grow limestone structures up to 5 times faster than a natural reef, using nothing but a weak electrical current running through seawater. But if this technology is really that powerful, why haven't we deployed it across every dying reef on the planet? And if it can actually reverse coral decline at this speed, should it be scaled up right now? Let's find out. The idea of using electricity to build mineral structures directly out of seawater is one of the newest engineering solutions in human history. We've already covered a version of this mechanism. Ancient builders used to work with mineral accumulation this way, using stalactite formation in caves as inspiration for early architectural domes. But nature had never needed electricity to do this before. Biorock is different because it doesn't rely on any living organism to lay down the initial structure at all. In the warm coastal waters off Indonesia and later the Caribbean, marine scientists faced a problem no traditional conservation method could solve. Coral bleaching events were killing reefs faster than natural larvae could recolonize the rubble left behind, and transplanting coral fragments onto bare rock wasn't enough on its own, since the fragments still had to survive years of exposure before forming a stable base. Concrete artificial reefs were an option, but they were inert, expensive to place at scale, and did nothing to actively help coral grow faster once installed. So in 1976, a German architect named Wolf Hilbertz turned to a process already used in industrial metal plating, electrolysis, and applied it to the open ocean. And unlike anything built from poured or precast material, this structure forms itself directly out of dissolved minerals already present in seawater, requiring no cement, no mining, and no human labor beyond running a low-voltage cable. Hilbertz's technique is simple, yet extraordinarily elegant, drawing on 3 separate electrochemical principles that work together to fix a problem no passive structure can solve on its own. A steel frame is submerged and connected to a low-voltage direct current power source, typically running at 12 volts or less, sourced from solar panels, wind, or wave-generated electricity floating nearby. Once the current begins flowing, the frame becomes a cathode, and dissolved minerals already present in seawater begin migrating toward it the same way iron filings are drawn toward a magnet. The first principle at work is mineral accretion. As calcium and magnesium ions in the water are pulled toward the negatively charged frame, they combine with dissolved carbonates and precipitate directly onto the metal surface as a solid mineral coating. The key point here is that unlike coral, which builds its skeleton through slow biological metabolism, this limestone layer forms through a purely chemical reaction, meaning it continues thickening for as long as the current keeps flowing. But here's what most people don't realize. The structure doesn't stop forming once the initial coating appears. You see, it also leverages something called continuous crystalline layering, where new mineral deposits bond directly onto the layer beneath them, thickening the coral-like limestone shell year after year without ever needing to be poured or replaced. In a structure running continuously for over a decade, this ongoing layering creates a dense porous limestone base that closely mimics the natural texture coral needs to attach and thrive. The third principle is accelerated biological colonization. Because the resulting mineral surface has a texture and chemical composition remarkably similar to natural coral skeleton, transplanted coral fragments attached to the structure grow faster and survive at dramatically higher rates than fragments placed on bare rock or dead reef. All three of these effects compound one another. The result is a structure that generates its own growing substrate while simultaneously accelerating the biological recovery happening on top of it. And this simple technology has been proven to be remarkably effective. Long-term monitoring at the Karang Lestari project in Bali found that coral fragments attached to Biorock structures showed survival rates exceeding 80%. Compared to survival rates below 50% for fragments transplanted directly onto untreated rubble. And field measurements taken at sites in the Maldives showed coral growth rates on Biorock structures reaching 2 to 6 times faster than coral growing on natural substrate nearby. To put that in practical terms, a single mid-sized Biorock structure can support hundreds of coral fragments across a metal frame spanning several meters, restoring a functioning reef ecosystem in a time frame measured in years rather than the decades natural recovery would require. And because the structure runs on continuous low-voltage current, the mineral accretion process never stops as long as power keeps flowing. But these numbers come with an important caveat, and it's part of the reason why Biorock has become far less common than the results alone would suggest. A study published by marine engineers, reviewing multiple installation sites, found that a functioning Biorock reef requires an uninterrupted power supply for years at a time. And even a temporary loss of current can halt mineral accretion and allow existing deposits to begin dissolving back into the surrounding seawater. Their conclusion was that no single structure can be considered permanent without ongoing infrastructure investment. And this is where consistent maintenance becomes critical. A reef started with strong initial funding is only sustained if that funding and the physical hardware powering it continues indefinitely. But the power dependency is only one piece of the story. The most problematic issue was infrastructure cost. The defining feature of this technology, its reliance on a continuous electrical current, is also the primary barrier keeping it from wider deployment. Submerged cables, anchored solar arrays, and corrosion-resistant electrical components all require specialized marine engineering knowledge and regular inspection, expenses that most small conservation nonprofits and coastal communities simply can't sustain year after year. And there's a more subtle institutional problem. A kind of funding mismatch. This occurs when a government or NGO prioritizes short-term coral transplanting programs because they can be completed, budgeted, and photographed within a single grant cycle. Because rapid transplanting delivers visible before and after imagery in months rather than years, most conservation funding gets allocated towards simpler, cheaper methods. For this reason, most environmental grant committees favor one-time restoration projects, and because those are easier to report on within a funding period, the Biorock technique is usually the one that gets left out of long-term conservation budgets entirely. But beyond the funding gap, there is the issue of patent restriction. Biorock's core process has remained under patent protection for decades, and in the conservation science community, Open, unrestricted methods drive wider adoption. Simpler concrete or ceramic reef substrates, by comparison, can be manufactured and deployed by any local organization without licensing fees. Marine conservation groups across the world have frequently opted for these unrestricted alternatives because they disrupt the standardized, low-cost formula that makes small-scale restoration projects financially viable. And even where wealthy resort operators have funded Biorock installations to protect valuable tourist reefs, many nearby community-led projects have worked around licensing costs by building simplified electrical reef structures using unpatented techniques, which produce slower results but avoid ongoing fees entirely. Environmental permitting has also made it more difficult to implement Biorock at scale. As coastal development regulations have become stricter around submerged electrical infrastructure, agencies in many countries now require extensive environmental review before approving any underwater power source. Because a Biorock reef's long-term maintenance depends on funding variables no marine biologist can fully guarantee on paper, it falls into a regulatory gray area in several jurisdictions. So the real question we should be asking now is whether more reefs should be restored this way. And the honest answer depends entirely on where you're working and what you're trying to accomplish. If you're in a region with strong tourism revenue or dedicated conservation funding, coastal Indonesia, parts of the Maldives, or similar reef-dependent economies, a Biorock installation remains one of the most effective ways to accelerate coral recovery. The upfront cost of a mid-sized structure runs into the tens of thousands of dollars, including solar infrastructure, while ongoing maintenance adds a modest annual expense on top of that. For a reef supporting a major dive tourism industry, the accelerated recovery can offset that investment within just a few years of restored visitor revenue. And because the growing limestone structure continues protecting the shoreline from wave erosion as it matures, the reef can reduce coastal damage for decades after it becomes self-sustaining. But in regions without reliable long-term funding or stable coastal infrastructure, a Biorock project is probably not a realistic choice. In areas prone to political instability or frequent storm damage to power infrastructure, the continuous current required simply can't be guaranteed, shutting the entire accretion process down at unpredictable intervals. And in a community without the institutional capacity to maintain submerged electrical systems for years at a time, the ambitious installation would likely be abandoned before it ever reached a self-sustaining coral cover. In reality, for most immediate restoration needs, particularly urgent ones following a bleaching event, simple coral transplanting onto cleaned rubble is probably the more practical choice. A standard transplant project can be organized within weeks rather than years, delivering an immediately visible, low-cost restoration effort. And because it doesn't depend on continuous power, specialized marine electricians, or ongoing licensing fees, it eliminates the infrastructure burden that a Biorock system inherently carries. There are no vanishing power sources, no multi-year funding commitments, and no risk of a half-grown reef losing its mineral coating overnight. It just gets planted, and it starts growing from day one. If you like this video and enjoy learning how modern science is racing to save ecosystems, the old methods couldn't move fast enough to protect, then subscribing and sharing is the simplest way to make sure this kind of knowledge keeps being found. And if you want to see how ancient Amazonian communities engineered a super fertile soil that scientists are now copying to fight climate change, then you need to watch our video on Terra Preta right here.